Central Asia sits at the heart of some of the most significant geopolitical developments of the 21st century, spanning over 4 million square kilometres or 1.5 million square miles, and with a combined population of 80 million, the area incorporates 5 countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, and is one of the most important regions in the world. And yet, it's also one of the least understood areas in international relations. It's barely discussed in the news or talked about by policymakers. So, to discuss this vital region, why it matters, why it's overlooked, and why it's becoming a battleground between key world powers, I'm joined by Michael Hilliard, Director of Defence and Security Analysis at the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us for this. I guess the best place to start is to take a look at the region, and it really is an area that doesn't get a lot of international attention, and yet it's talked about as being so significant. So maybe you could just sort of give us an introduction to what is Central Asia and why it's so important, and yet it does tend to seem to be ignored so often.
Thank you for having me, first of all. But, Central Asia is a region that is becoming more and more important right now for a whole list of reasons. One, it's interesting watching the difference between a waning Russian power and obviously a growing China power. But also it's becoming very important for a lot of mining companies, particularly guys like uranium, oil, gas, because if you're, let's say, currently working in the Sahel, that region is becoming less and less stable, more difficult to work in, whereas you look to Central Asia and these are fairly stable republics. And particularly when it comes to guys like Kazakhstan, they make business very easy for international companies. So this is a region that is really quickly growing economically and in importance for a whole bunch of minerals and materials that, frankly, are mostly acquired before this from very unstable areas of the world.
This is an area that we know that it had been part of the Soviet Union. And again, I think we often think about Central Asia as just being this sort of almost homogenous mass of these 5 countries, but they are very different from each other. And so maybe it'd be sort of worth just having a bit of a pen portrait of how these countries have sort of emerged from that post-Cold War, that post-Soviet space, and become very, very different entities. So, I mean, when we think of it, Kazakhstan does seem to be very different from Uzbekistan, which is very different from Kyrgyzstan, from Tajikistan to Turkmenistan. So maybe just take a look at that, maybe starting with Kazakhstan as the biggest of the lot.
So all 5 of the republics are really different from each other. If I get it from the outside, people don't pay a lot of attention. They do tend to get lumped in together. If we start with Kazakhstan, I've always I describe Kazakhstan as kind of that big brother who grew up and became an accountant and now pays for the Christmas party. It's very much the richest of the Central Asian 5. It's got a highly technologically, it's much more advanced than most, particularly with military and communication affairs. It's the easiest for business for a long time. In fact, you can these days do all your arbitration through the British high courts rather than having to deal with local, because they're just very encouraging of business being in there. And they are the largest when it comes to defense production, as well as the largest when it comes to most factories being there. Again, a lot because of the Soviet Union infrastructure left over. So they're kind of they're the economic powerhouse. And I'm going to annoy half of Central Asia saying this, but in most things, you'll find Kazakhstan are usually kind of the leaders. If there's 5 of them there at a summit, it's probably Tokayev and Kazakhstan who sit in the middle as the kind of chair of things. Next up is Uzbekistan. They are kind of, for lack of a better word, they're the population center. If you ask kind of what is a typical Central Asian, they're probably going to think of an Uzbek, mostly because it's the majority of the population. It's where most of the old Silk Road stuff used to be. If you want to go to Bukhara or Khiva, that's all in Uzbekistan. And it's the only one out of the 5 that borders all the other 4. So it's kind of the central hub for everything. And the largest city in the region is Tashkent. So it is kind of the heart of Central Asia. Then you have Kyrgyzstan, which is effectively just the east of Uzbekistan. I always kind of describe that as like that cousin of yours who really likes nature. There's a lot of mountains, there's a lot of horse riding. It's kind of a bit almost the most Mongolian of the 5, very much into the kind of the steppe era. And until very recently has always been the island of democracy out of these guys. You had, let's say, if, down in the 20s and 30s for freedom scores. Kyrgyzstan used to be up around the 50s, 60s. It's kind of Hungary, back end of Europe areas. When all the other countries at the end of the Soviet Union went and got, pretty much the same Soviet government, just with a new flag on the wall, Kyrgyzstan elected a physicist to lead them. And they've had pretty free press for a long time. They made business quite easy. That's changed in the last few years. So they have a government in now led by a strongman who they're now only 1 point above Kazakhstan, and they might lose that title very soon. But they've always been seen as the island of democracy and very different to the other four. Then it'd be Tajikistan. They're the poorest of the five, and they are, again, the odd kind of stepchild of the Central Asians, because rather than the other four, which are Turkic in ethnicity, they're actually closer to Persians. Their Tajik as a language is much closer to Iranian than it would be to Turkish. And they kind of also, a lot of their foreign policy has been shaped by the fact that the majority of the Afghan border, or particularly the most populous bits of the Afghan border, are butted up against Tajikistan. And that's very much shaped their foreign policy for a while. Then the last one is Turkmenistan. And the way I usually describe it is Turkmenistan is a country that has as much gas as Qatar, but is actually lower on the Freedom House Index than North Korea for freedoms. It is a very, very closed society and increasingly paranoid leadership in power, which people kind of go, oh, it's a dictatorship. And then they go, wow, okay, it's lower than North Korea. It kind of gives you an idea of what you're dealing with in Turkmenistan. So all five are very different characteristically when you actually start to look into them. And all five have, very different economies. The thing that kind of binds them together is mostly just, the kind of Russia-China dynamic going on at the moment. And a lot of the infrastructure still relies quite heavily on Russia. It's as if Moscow designed all the train lines to head towards Russia, which is kind of what happens. But yes, they're all very, very different republics when you get into them.
But it would also be sort of interesting to take a bit of a look of what the relationships are between these different countries, because we know, for example, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have had border issues with each other. But what has generally been the relationship that they've had with one another?
This is the $1 million question in the whole region at the moment. That there are so many initiatives and programs and actions going on between these five to try and bind them further together. Reintegrate power grids together, start to build production chains together, and that is starting to happen between some of them. Pulling gas out of Uzbekistan and refining it in Kazakhstan, so they can work together and build mutual industries. But there is always a hard layer on how far they're willing to integrate with the others. Right now, they're happy to trade water and be really kind of trading amongst themselves a little bit. But, even when things like they all use the same tanks, they all use the same artillery, they all use the same kind of equipment, none of them were willing to integrate their defense procurement almost at all together because they don't really trust each other that far. There's still a lot of distrust between security services of each of these places. There's still, borders can just arbitrarily close at times. But generally, it's, particularly since 2022, when Russia has not been as active in the region, these guys are looking to bind together. And, outfits like the C5, which is effectively the Central Asian Five, are becoming much more important, that these guys are looking to kind of work together and build mutual economies. The only trouble being that a lot of them export and import the exact same things. So they kind of have a mutual interest to not do that at times, which obviously dampens prospects a little bit too.
And I'm sort of very much reminded of sort of with the European Union and the way that integration has worked there. I mean, obviously, so much of that is sort of based on common values and the sense of having democracies. And it's not just the sense of democracy is important, it's everything that goes with it. So, for example, rule of law. And one of the things that's often pointed out is that the reason that the European Union works is that there is a confidence of investors when they're working from one member state into another, that if they run into difficulties, they can go before a court in that country and they will be given a fair hearing. And yet you sort of raise very interesting questions. For example, the difference between Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. How do you deal with that sort of level of integration when you've got one country which is so closed and the other one which is actually relatively free?
I do a lot of consulting for mining companies who are looking to get into the region. And there is this kind of, hey, look, if you're going to deal with Turkmenistan, you're going to be paying a lot of bribes and you've got to effectively have friends inside in the administration who will sign off, because it is just, that will be whether your project stands or doesn't stand. It's getting a little better, but generally it's still very much that way. Uzbekistan's starting to liberalize a bit of their stuff, but they're still very touchy about a lot of industries, telecommunications being a key one. Kazakhstan has effectively gone with this system of, if you don't like the decisions that we make locally, you can take arbitration and do it completely within the British system and we'll abide by the British system, which again took power out of the Kazakh leadership's hands, but they also know that it attracts investment. Now, Kyrgyzstan used to kind of go with a somewhat similar system, and it did lure companies in, particularly Canadian mining companies. But then they had the new leader come in, Japarov, who decided to take the biggest gold mine in the country and just absorb it, just nationalize it, take it away from the Canadian company. And that's scaring investment away. Obviously, a lot of people don't realize that with mining, a lot of the time you kind of put your money in and you lose money for the first 10 years, because it's a big upfront capital investment. And then for the back 20, that's where you actually make your money. So if you're worried about putting a project in, you have to be kind of sure that, hey, can I lose money for 10 years and then the government will allow me to make the money for the following 20? With Kazakhstan, that is very much guaranteed. They've been working with outside partners for a long time. With Uzbekistan, it's getting better. Tajikistan, it's still pretty hit and miss. And Turkmenistan, I would be cautious about investing into Turkmenistan too much. But generally, it's opening up. They're realizing that this capital coming in is good, and they're realizing that, yes, even if you have to open the lid of freedoms a little bit more, it does tend to improve the lives of the citizens. So, it's a very positive prospect looking forward.
But of course, when we think about Central Asia, I mean, it does seem to be that more and more we sort of think of it in geopolitical terms. And I mean, I guess we've always thought of it to a degree in geopolitical terms, but especially at the moment. And, I'd like to sort of break down that sort of relationship that they have with three main actors: Russia, China, and Turkey. But perhaps let's start with Russia. And obviously there is that influence of the Soviet era, that complete dominance that Russia had in so many ways. Perhaps sort of just explain what happened to that Russian influence following the end of the Soviet Union, and obviously more recently, what's happened with the Ukraine war and how has that affected perceptions of Russia and Russian influence in these countries?
So obviously, when the Soviet Union fell and we end up with five new republics, four of them pretty much keep the same Soviet regime they had beforehand. So not a lot changes in the fundamentals of the government. Although they still, they are a republic that look to themselves, there's still a lot of ties in with Russia. In fact, Russian troops only left Turkmenistan in the year 2000, and they're still there in three of the other republics. So there's still a lot of Russian integration. I kind of want to break down into three different categories here. When it comes to military affairs, Russia is still the dominant player. Like, they are the ones who are the big basing in there. Most of the equipment they have is Soviet legacy. A lot of it is, if you need to get a gearbox for one of your tanks, you probably go buy it from the Russians. Russia is still, even though it doesn't do as much exercises and isn't, as active with the CSTO as it used to be for a whole bunch of reasons we can go into later. Russia is still a very dominant within the security services and the military. When it comes to government, these guys are still genuinely friendly with Russia. A lot of them, grew up, in that very Russia-connected world. And even Tokayev, I find Tokayev is the current leader of Kazakhstan, who effectively was they had a guy, Nazarbayev had been in for years, and he put Tokayev as his vice president, as the kind of, you're the nerd, you can do the nerd things, and I'll run the country. And then Tokayev gets overthrown, and we actually have a technocrat come into power. And Tokayev was the foreign minister. He speaks like 6 languages fluently. He's very good in his diplomat. And I find it interesting that he gives speeches in Russian and then he'll give the same speech in English, and they have slightly different meanings. Because he'll play he's happy. He just wants to be happy with every side. He's being in Russian friendly. So he'll say, we don't recognize, Russia's gains in Ukraine. But then in the Russian version, we'll say, much like we don't recognize, Taiwan or Kashmir or any of these border disputes, we stick with the borders the UN gave us, and that's how we run with it. So there is a difference in government and difference in how people tend to perceive it. What is really interesting is the cultural aspect. It's only since the war in Ukraine really kicked off that the conversations about, Russian invasion of Kazakhstan has been coming up more and more. I get a lot of interviews and questions about that. And I've been going to the region for years, and it's only since 2022 I've had people, I'll get in a cab or go to a bar and I'll ask them in Russian saying, hey, look, can I get a drink, whatever. And occasionally now, particularly younger ones will push back on me and say, oh, sorry, we speak Uzbek, which would be unthinkable 10 years ago. Does it mean that they're going to be anti-Russia anytime soon? No, probably not. But it's, that is a difficult problem to kind of push out the system in a short term. Because once that generation becomes older and starts to become the diplomats and starts to become the kind of policymakers, they're going to have a lot more anti-Russia bent into themselves. The trouble will always be that right now, most of the train lines and exit out of the region will either go into China, there's a lot of distrust of China, and we'll go through that in a bit, or it goes into Russia. And if you have to rely on the Russians, then you have to work with the Russians, and that kind of keeps it there. So culturally, yes, there's a bit of a bent, particularly since 2022, and it didn't help when a bunch of Russians fled into Central Asia and started flooding the local housing markets and renting everything for double price. But at the same time, the security services still work very closely with Russia, and the economy is still very tied with Russia. I think the other big aspect here is remittances. There's if if you're, I think it's about 29% for the Kyrgyz, about 14% for the Uzbek, and 49% of the entire Tajik economy comes from Tajiks going to Russia to do work and manual labor, drive taxis, do food delivery, and then send the money back to Tajikistan, which means effectively Putin could change the visa laws and 49% of the Tajik economy disappears overnight. That's a massive, sword to hang over the Tajik government, and that's a huge part of their going to influence their government. Whereas you also got to think about, Tokayev, who is stuck between Russia and China and being Kazakhstan. He also, when the big uprisings of 2022 happened, it was the Russians who led the CSTO in to stop that, help quash those riots and keep him in power. He kind of owes his position to the Russians. So that will obviously be playing into his psyche. It's whilst Turkey might be a bit nicer and whilst China might be more economically viable, can you rely on those two to come in and save you the next time there's a national uprising? I'm not completely sure they would. So that will be, particularly for some of the more authoritarian states, that will be in the back of their head as well.
I guess that's something that has also been developing for quite a while. And we often think of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and that sort of recreation, if you like, of that Silk Road idea. But just how is China getting involved in Central Asia, and how is it going down with the different countries?
China views Central Asia as crucial and very important. In fact, the Belt and Road Initiative was announced in Kazakhstan initially. China is becoming the largest trading partner to a lot of these guys, particularly with Turkmenistan, where, depending on the year, somewhere between 86 and 94% of all exports go to China, which means the Chinese effectively run the Turkmen economy, because if you've got one customer, the customer will effectively determine the price. It is the middleman for a lot of these guys. Whilst they might export their goods through Russia to the European markets, it's usually importing, consumer goods, laptops, that kind of stuff in from China. And that's, particularly for the Kyrgyz, as a re-export market, has become a massive part of their economy. It's not a surprise that when sanctions went on Russia, the Kyrgyz trade on a whole bunch of things went way up, because they buy things in and sell on to the Russians. So China is becoming, they're supporting huge projects, they're building tunnels, they're building infrastructure, they're getting very tied in with a lot of these administrations, but there's also a massive amount of Sinophobia in these places. You can go out, if you go out to Tajikistan particularly, you'll have tunnels that are so desperately needed, are so game-changing for the local economy that this tunnel was built. It was completely funded by Chinese money. But when you ask locals, they go, oh, they built it big enough for tanks. I was like, okay, what? That's not what that's there for, but sure. People talk about Chinese men stealing their wives, but when you call the embassy, there's like only been 2 or 3 weddings they've actually had to do paperwork for in the last 2 years. So it's very odd. There's a lot of distrust in China still left in the region. What I find really interesting is the Chinese military presence is creeping in. Everyone's been talking a lot about this. It's technically not military, it's the People's Armed Police, but they've got a small base in the very east of Tajikistan. And China seemed like they were kind of wading in to be, a bit of a military competitor with Central Asia. And then things started going wrong for them in Pakistan, where effectively they hit this awful cycle of troops would come in to defend Chinese assets. They get attacked by locals because they earn more. The Chinese would shoot back at the locals would get mad, and they shoot back at the Chinese. So you bring in more Chinese and end up in this cycle. So rather than that, the Chinese have kind of tried a completely different game in Central Asia, which is, I'm not going to really put my men on the ground. I'm just going to pay you to put an entire extra brigade or entire extra battalions of border force or ground troops on, and you can go do the security services, but we will throw cash at you to do that. And it's been a much more successful way of playing games out here. So China kind of does a lot of its field testing on policies that it will roll out, in Central Asia 1 year and then Africa 3 years later. So it's why a lot of your kind of very big China watchers are very closely watching what happens in Central Asia. But yes, China economically is the powerhouse that's coming up, and it's becoming more and more important to these economies, particularly as Russia becomes weaker.
And how do you see that relationship between Moscow and Beijing over Central Asia? I mean, is there we know that Russia is obviously highly dependent on China at the moment. It's a very complex relationship. And you'd imagine that in terms of foreign policy, this is probably where they come up against each other most closely. You sort of talk about how China is very important for sort of manufactured goods, whereas it's remittances that come from the workers who go off to Russia. So in both ways, they seem to be so closely involved in these countries. But is that causing tensions, or do they find a way of managing that?
There are some tensions. Obviously, there's a bit of distrust between the two, but right now they kind of seem to be staying off each other's toes. And I'm very much oversimplifying here, but Russia is handling security and a lot of those affairs, and kind of staying with a lot of the oligarchs, and China is doing more of the economics in the region and doing more of the trade. And China is trying not to step on Russia's toes when it doesn't need to. But I do find it interesting that, particularly in places like Tajikistan, they just funded a massive upgrade of a border school training facility right next to the big Russian base, which raised a lot of eyebrows. China is starting to push in and offer more drones and offer more programs to train officers, which is something that you don't see, really have an effect for about 10 years. Because officer corps, when you train them at the kind of mid-level, will become, effectively the guys who make decisions at the top level in 10 years' time. And so Russia is worried about it, but at the same time so overstretched that it's not, pushing back. And that's the kind of the other angle of this, is the Central Asians are also very aware that Russia has been the kind of only person offering them anything for a long time. But now they have, China, and they have Turkey, and they have a few other players. They know that every time they start to talk a little bit to China, Russia then scrambles back and goes, "Oh, don't worry, I'll give you that air defense system. Don't worry, just don't buy China's." So it's great for Central Asia. They actually have someone to play off against Russia. But yes, right now I don't think Russia's in a position where it really could push back. But this is setting the stage for further pushback in about 10 to 15 years.
The really big actor in many ways that we think about now when it comes to Central Asia is Turkey. And, that's been a fascinating relationship that I know that at the end of the Cold War, Turkey really saw an opportunity to get involved, and it was sort of rather rebuffed. But now when we look at what's going on, the fact that these countries are organizing themselves, you've got the organization of Turkic states, that Turkey is very, very closely involved with, very central in many ways under Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But how is that also playing out? What are we seeing on the ground in terms of Turkey's influence? And again, how do these countries respond to that? And how does it play out against sort of that relationship with Beijing and Moscow?
Yeah, Turkey's probably the most interesting kind of newer character to look at in this whole story. For Turkmenistan, Turkey is actually quite big in their economy. While they export a lot to China because they're so far the other way direction-wise, they kind of actually import a lot in from Turkey. Turkey's also offering a lot more visas for these guys. They have a lot of cultural overlap, and generally they find that most Central Asians will get along with a lot of Turkish people. So generally there is better relations. They are starting to become more important, and particularly for Kyrgyzstan, Turkey's really starting to get into the defense industry as well. Turkish drones have become the be-all, end-all, and that's very much upsetting Tajikistan because they won't sell as much to Tajikistan because they're non-Turkic, which then pushes Iran to then sell stuff to Tajikistan. So you're starting to see that angle creeping in as well. So Turkey is becoming more important, but I think there's a very hard ceiling on what they can, achieve in this region. Economically, China and Russia are always going to be the keys here. They are either geographically, because you're forced to go that way, or China's just such an economic behemoth that it can throw massive amount of money around. Unfortunately for Central Asia, if let's put yourselves in Uzbekistan's shoes, you want to export stuff out, you can go south, but then you either got to go through Iran, which is, you wish sanctions. You go through Afghanistan, which is risky and horrifyingly expensive once you put insurance and whatnot in, or you end up having to go through China or Russia. The Caspian Sea is starting to open up, but the ports are really not designed for high amounts of traffic. So it becomes prohibitively expensive to the point where Central Asian goods, even if they're cheaper than elsewhere, become uncompetitive. So Turkey will probably have economic struggles. Military-wise, they're doing a lot of coordination at sort of mid-offices and a lot of cross special forces exercises. Great to see. But, if let's say Turkey was to announce its own military alliance or something of that variety, maybe Azerbaijan joins, but, Uzbekistan won't. They're too neutral. They got neutrality built into the constitution. Turkmenistan does as well. And Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are all part of the Russian-led CSTO. So it kind of cuts them out as well. So, again, would Turkey come to save any of these governments if they had a national uprising? I'm not as sure they would as I think the Russians would be keen to do so. So it's the big player, and it is one of those. Turkey will come in and offer more, hey, we're going to sell you a bunch of, armored vehicles. We're going to bring you a bunch of gearboxes because Russia's not, pulling its weight. And then Russia will scream back in 2 weeks later and say, no, we'll get you the gearboxes you need. So big player, one to watch. And culturally, though, that generation that kind of Russia is losing at the moment is the ones that Turkey is trying to appeal to. But still very early days in that relationship. And there's a lot of fundamentals to get over before we can, call them at the same level as a Russia or a China.
I guess on a final note, then the question then becomes, and what about the West? What about Europe? What about the United States? And of course, it is difficult to talk about the West in some ways, these days. But certainly that element, you painted a very clear picture of, Russia and China through geography, Turkey less so. But what sort of role are the Europeans, are the Americans playing in this region?
Unfortunately, not enough and nowhere near enough. The Americans are, I think the best summary I've ever seen of what happened is the first time the five leaders met, was at, I think it was at a UN meeting. It was during the Biden administration. And the first time we kind of had this big, big moment for Central Asia, that it's Biden, Blinken, and the 5 Central Asian presidents. And they put this photo up saying, with all the Central Asian presidents, but got the photo wrong. And it was when the president of Turkmenistan was in the, off for taking a phone call, and it's the foreign minister in the photo, which just shows you how little attention they're paying, that they didn't even realize it wasn't actually the president. Central Asia became incredibly important at the very beginning of the war in Afghanistan, and even in the Iraq campaigns, and it's just slowly taken a bit of a back burner ever since. Maybe it will start to become more important, but it's a region that the business community, the mining community, the investment community, Kazakhstan is talking about doubling its GDP by 2030, and it's on track to do so. It's a massively growing economy, but governments aren't paying enough attention. The British government, they just before Sama came in, had David Cameron go all the way out to Central Asia, and he spent more on his travel arrangements to get there than he did in donating to Central Asia. We're talking that kind of very lip service programs going on. But whilst the West are focused elsewhere, the security of services is going to get more interested, particularly if Iran becomes problematic or China becomes more of an issue. Central Asia does become much more important once again. But I'd hope it becomes more than mining or defense and that there is genuine interest there. But for now, I think the US is barely holding it together in most continents, let alone Central Asia.
Michael, look, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us to discuss Central Asia. And I know that there's a lot more that we could have gone into, but hopefully that will have given everyone a little bit of a better picture of this region. So thank you so much once again.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.